Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, we are talking about how shorts prove they need liquidity, why the apes will win, shorts admitting to squeeze, and many more in this video. First, we're taking a look at this. AMC, just remember, boys and girls, if AMC wasn't so big and retail didn't step up, we wouldn't have the show system about to expose the criminal markets in America being put on hold and extended to weigh in economic impacts. So a lot of things has happened right now, and we are seeing how once again UBS is at the forefront and proving everything we've said. So we talked about the volatility event that's about to happen, and recently you can see UBS took up a long, large AMC position around 31 million shares 6 months ago, only to dump these AMC shares at a loss, but held until just after UBS's crisis resolution plan cleared the US SEC. What if these actions are linked? UBS used a temporary AMC hedge to appear netted for SEC approval. So for those of you who don't know the backstory, UBS essentially inherited all of the Credit Suisse positions. Now, Credit Suisse had two extremely toxic positions, which were AMC and GME swaps. And ever since UBS inherited all of these Credit Suisse positions, they have been in an extremely bad situation where they needed margin, where they were seeing how margin requirements were being raised because of the liquidity problem. Now, 6 months ago, we talked about this, how because of these toxic AMC swaps, they had to buy AMC positions, they had to buy AMC shares, and we saw that with the 31 million shares closing to 32 million. Now, recently, they've just sold it, but there's a big thing that's happened in between that makes this buying and selling extremely important. And they just proved once again why we've said that AMC is extremely volatile for these hedge funds. So we firstly are talking about how they bought in the 31 million shares, then we talk about how they are selling. Now, the reason why this is important is because previously they held 6.2, as we talked about with the 31 million shares, and you can see now how the SEC is giving UBS green light for bail in. So they saw this regulatory relief after being forced to absorb Credit Suisse position back in 2023. Now, we already had our guesses when they first originally bought these shares, because it was odd that the guys who were talking about shorting AMC suddenly decided to buy in. Now it makes a lot of sense to why they did, because they held the bag of these AMC and GME swaps. They needed to prove that even when AMC blows up, they won't go bankrupt, and that's why they bought in the 31, close to 32 million shares. And now that they've made their books look better, now that they can prove to these authorities that when AMC blows up, they're not going to go bankrupt, they now get rid of it because they managed to get the relief from the SEC. And this is how we know that a lot of things are happening behind the scenes. When we talk about how institutions want to buy up as much as possible, when we talk about how institutions are trying to force retail to sell, it's because the ones who got caught with these positions, who got caught with shorting, who got caught with the swaps, are all in heavy red. And that's why they need to buy in. You can also see here as we talk about the DTCC, where according to a spokesperson for the US clearing and settlement entity, DTCC, a large volume of erroneous trades on Monday led to a massive settlement balance that cannot be corrected before the Federal Reserve daily trading cutoff time. As a result, DTCC initiated a formal emergency procedure to address market disruptions and partial holidays. And you can see the title where erroneous trades forced DTCC to take a rare double settlement date. Now, this is all linking up, just like we talked about at the very start. Why do they buy and why do they sell just as they get the approval? And we talk about how the DTCC were forced to take a double settlement date when there were these erroneous trades. And so once again, there is no confirmation or 100% linking that this is to do with AMC. So we are not saying that this is 100%, but the timing of this is again impeccable. And a lot of these things, and we've already said this, and you can go back to my previous video, this is something that I stand by and I say this all the time. A lot of the times when you see something happening within the market, whether it's system errors, wherever it's suddenly the data centers glitches out, wherever it's the sudden double settlement day that we're seeing, whether it's a large liquidity melt, all of these are happening when there is something to do with AMC or GME. And so just like this, we are seeing it happening once again. As we see this whole erroneous trades happening, as we see the SEC regulatory approval for Credit Suisse, suddenly they're getting rid of their AMC shares. So we clearly think that there is something going on. And it wouldn't surprise us to know, because we understand very well by now in terms of the impact that we have. We firstly saw the impact of AMC on Robinhood. Now we're seeing the impact of AMC on large banks like UBS and of course institutions and other hedge funds that are out there. But that isn't the only thing that's stopping. Firstly, we have to realize is that the only option right now available for short sellers is to continue to use every trick in the book to delay the inevitable and keep stockpiling the wave that is ultimately going to wash the great majority of them away. And we already know about why they're trying to prevent this and how we're seeing the struggles. Like we've said, with the whole UBS situation, it is just a proof of how deadly AMC can be. But you can talk about the tricks right now. And just like we've said, they want retail to sell. They want to give anything they can to force retail to sell so that institutions can be buying. Because we can see here, an article has been released on July 12th, where they talk about as if AMC is about to dilute, whilst we all know that this dilution has already been completed June 25, where it's talking about AMC selling 95 million shares to raise $200 million. Now, this is something we've already talked about last month. This is something that we have already covered, but they just released an article on July 12th, as you guys can see here, talking about this. Now, we know very well by now in terms of the intent that's behind these articles, because for those of you who maybe haven't done the due diligence or you're not keeping up to AMC, or for any new investors, in retail investors in general, who want to look into investing into a theater stock, who is looking to AMC, and suddenly they see this article, they might think that this is happening right now. But this is something that has already happened. We've already talked about the pros and cons of this dilution. Once again, I want to highlight, I've not talked about how this dilution is 100% perfect for AMC. I talked about how, yes, a dilution is bad, but we also talked about what the money can be used. So once again, there is the pros, there is the cons, but it definitely isn't something that's happening again. It definitely isn't something that these articles are trying to create the context for. And so this is how we know that, once again, they're using the strategies to force retail to sell. And the question we ask ourselves all the time is, why would they do this if there isn't any fear on AMC? Another big thing is how StockGrid website was removed from the internet. Now, this is something that essentially shows blockchain movement on AMC, or at least is on-chain movement for AMC. Now, what I find this interesting is that essentially on-chain is something that we can see to be as transparent as possible, at least as of right now. And the fact that they're removing something that is showing transparency, along with the limitations we're seeing them put on the CAT system, you can see once again, they are afraid of what will actually happen when they show true transparency. When they show exactly what's going on behind the scenes, when they talk about the amount of tokenizations, the amount of synthetics, the amount of swaps, the amount of FTDs that are out for AMC, they realize that they will have to expose the billions of dollars of corruption, the trillions of dollars of corruption, because we've seen how big this can all get. And so this is just another case of how they don't want the truth to be told. And so for the fraudsters who claim AMC has been through an out-of-court debt restructurings are not wrong. That's all there is to it. That doesn't hold up. My conviction is Citadel Adam has just peeled off all AMC hurdles that have protected the UBS massive short position from being exposed. So a big thing we need to take away from this is that firstly, they're gonna try and cling on to any negative news they can. And just like we talked about, dilution was one of them. And like we've said, there was some negatives to do with the dilution, but in my opinion, I do think that the benefit outweighs the cons. However, they only have these things that they can cling on. And what we are also seeing from this whole UBS situation as well is knowing truly that these guys are stuck with the short positions, and is that regulatory are seeing what is actually happening. They've realized just how toxic these positions they can be, and so they're forcing these institutions to take actions, wherever it is just to make the books look better for the time being, wherever it's buying as many shares as possible. That's what they're doing, and that's what we're seeing UBS doing as well. And another big thing along with this is Jim Cramer. So you can see right now where Jim Cramer warns retail investors AMC's turnaround play was ruined by a heinous balance sheet. So Jim Cramer with a platform that's obviously reaching out to a lot of investors, whether it's institutional, whether it's retail. Now, a big thing about these retail investors is that a majority of these retail investors who watch the shows clearly aren't apes, and that's completely fine. If you're new to here, if you're new to the whole industry, if you're new to AMC, if you're new to this channel, it's completely fine to being new. But of course, make sure you do your own due diligence, because just like we've seen what Jim Cramer is trying to say, is that he's trying to play it off as if AMC is doing bad fundamentally, when we've already covered exactly what AMC has been doing, exactly how well the box office is doing, and just how well AMC is doing. And the fact that he's trying to do this and put this out on his platform to let plenty of people to see, it obviously lets us understand that they still are going along with the agenda of forcing retail to stay away from AMC, and for the ones who already have stakes, to sell your stakes of AMC. Because as we see him talk about this, the cost of borrow suddenly just increased on AMC, where he told us to sell. And the interesting thing about this is that the cost of borrow, it's obviously something to do with short selling. So as we see Jim Cramer telling people to sell, and then we see AMC go down 1%, it just feels like to me is that shorts are trying to then borrow as many shares as possible to then short AMC to give this whole image to retail that it's because people are selling the AMC shares, as opposed to it's because of the countless of synthetics and shorts that they're trying to do on AMC. Just like we've said, some people may not do the extreme due diligence that apes are doing. They may just take it at face value. So whatever Jim Cramer is saying, they may just believe it to be true. So when Jim Cramer says that people are selling because of the balance sheet, and then we see AMC go down, people are led to believe that it is because investors of AMC are selling, as opposed to what we've said with how shorts are obviously trying to sell in terms of AMC. And so this is how we know that they are trying to create this false image once again. And along with this, you can see from John Hampton, this is someone we talked about for a very long time now. And essentially, he is a short seller of AMC. He's very vocal about AMC, very vocal about shorting AMC, ladder attacks, spoofing, anything you can basically think of about AMC. And what he has just said right now is that I think apes are a conspiracy to rig the market, forcing a squeeze. So for him, we talked about this in our previous video. Essentially, the reason why we're highlighting this is because for John Hampton, someone who's extremely vocal about AMC, someone who always is an advocate of shorting AMC, he only has a very tiny position in shorting AMC. Now, he is someone who said it's pretty much 100% sure money by shorting AMC, yet he's not then willing to act upon what he's saying. And it's because he realizes that AMC is able and will squeeze, and that's why he only has a tiny position, because it backs up what he's saying, but it's not big enough to bankrupt his fund when AMC squeezes. And I think that's the most important point, is that everyone who claims that AMC is going to go bankrupt, that AMC is going to go zero, in the back of their mind, they all know that AMC will squeeze. And just like we've seen, is that AMC is the most manipulated stock in NYSE history, and the short sellers are still trapped. And so this is why we've said that they are screwed. So we can see here, increase the flow by 95 million and volume completely dries up, while more and more articles are directed towards retail in an attempt to get us to sell. So again, for the people who are worried about dilution, you're worried about how 95 million shares are going to get these short sellers out. I've already talked about this, but I'll quickly go and brief this again. Essentially, for those of you who understand and believe that AMC will squeeze, you will know that AMC will squeeze because it has billions of shares that have been created. So even if Adam Aron is giving 95 million shares or even 500 million shares, remember, there are still billions that are out there. So it's obviously not going to get these short sellers out of the hole that they've dug for themselves. But more importantly, is the fact that we've seen the flow increase by 95 million, yet the volume is still completely dried up. So if they are truly covering these shares, if they are truly using all 95 million to then cover these shares by buying these positions, then there will be liquidity. But that hasn't happened. So we know that firstly, 95 million shares isn't going to cover up the hole they've dug for themselves, but also it talks about how they actually want these shares for themselves because they've realized the opportunity that AMC has going into the future. And so the fact is that AMC Mobiles is not on schedule for our calendar. It will happen for sure, but along the way, we must be careful to avoid landmines and false flags. And that's what we've said with everything that's ongoing with these articles that are targeted at retail. Again, knowing that some people are not willing to do due diligence and they just take it for face value, knowing that they're using these synthetic FTDs, we know that everything is going to happen and everything will happen for AMC. As always, known as F Financial Advice, and I'll catch you guys next time.